Okay, and so within both the central and the peripheral nervous system, we do have other cells that are non-nervous cells. So these are what we would call glial cells. So G-L-I-A-L. Right, glial cells are just the name for these non-nervous cells. Remember, the nervous cells are the right, are the neurons, and so these other cells are there to kind of support and play these other roles. So this figure is not in your textbook. Is this an additional one? This one kind of provides a nice overview, puts some of the things into maybe a larger picture context, whereas the figures in your textbook that we'll see on the next slide tend to be more isolated, so you don't really get a whole picture. So I'm not going to go into the detail on this slide, but just to point out some of the cells that we're going to look at in the next slide and how they fit into this puzzle here. Right, we have our neuron, which is this guy here, right? So there's our neuron cell here. Great, right? We can see the axon with the myelin sheath. So that's our nervous cell. That's our neuron. Some of these other glial cells that we'll take a look at are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal, and microglial. So an astrocyte, right, is this one here, which basically is going to connect a blood capillary to the neuron. We have these oligodendrocytes, right, which are going to actually be responsible for creating the myelin sheaths. So that's oligodendrocyte here. We have these ependymal cells, which are basically a type of epithelial cell. So it's that lining cell. So we can see they are here. And then we also have these really small guys back here called microglial cells. I'm going to take a look at each of these, both in the central nervous system and then a specific one in the peripheral nervous system based on the context of your textbook. Okay, so I'm going to start off with looking at these astrocytes. Right? So an astrocyte is, kind of the most abundant of the glial cells. You might see them as kind of neuroglia. Really, just they mean the same thing there. So these are the most common ones, right? So in this figure here, we can see the neuron off to the side. Here's a capillary, right? So there's our blood supply, and then we have this astrocyte here, which basically is going to kind of position itself between a capillary and the neuron itself. So the astrocyte's fairly large in size, has a lot of these different cell processes. So a lot of these extensions, right, coming off of it. And mentioned before, so it's going to be like the regulator between the capillary and the neuron. So it's going to really control what substances are going to come into contact with the neuron itself, right? So it's that kind of that regulatory function there. The microglial cells are they're smaller. Much smaller in size. They're not as common as the other cells that we'll take a look at here. And their responsibility is to destroy viruses and bacteria in the central nervous system. Right, so they're kind of keeping an eye out for any of the bad guys that are roaming around, and will do their part to remove any of those viruses or bacteria that we don't want coming into contact with our nervous cell, with our neurons. The ependymal cells, right? So they are a type of cuboidal epithelial cell that line the cavities in the brain and spinal cord, particularly where we're going to have a kind of like a fluid-filled cavity. So things like the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. We'll see next week. There's what are called ventricles that contain the cerebral spinal fluid. We can see here line cerebral spinal fluid. So they're going to have these cilia on the surface of that fluid. So kind of facing the cerebral spinal fluid, we're going to have cilia on that side there, and we can see, so this inner part is going to be that brain or spinal cord tissue here. So this is kind of inside the brain, and this is inside the brain or spinal cord here, and this would be inside some sort of fluid-filled space that we see. So we'll see a little bit next week. These are going to help really form that cerebral spinal fluid and help with the circulation of it, because of the cilia that are going to help kind of move things around a bit. And then finally, we have the oligodendrocytes, which are kind of these round bulbous types of cell, right? So kind of a nice, just a bulb shape there. But they're going to have, again, these different cytoplasmic extensions. And it's these extensions that are going to wrap around the axons to form the myelin sheath, right? So the myelin sheath is basically it's like a fatty coating around the axon of the nervous system cell of the neuron. All right, so remember, myelin sheath only on the axons, not on the dendrites. And again, it's this kind of this myelin sheath here that's going to help insulate the axon. It's going to help the electrical signal travel faster. Remember, it's going to just jump between these gaps here instead of a continuous flow. And it is actually like shows up as a lighter kind of these white color. And so it's these myelinated axons which are going to essentially give us the white matter of our central nervous system. So we'll see a little bit next week. We'll talk about gray matter and white matter of the brain. It's the white matter that's going to be all these different axons that are coated in this myelin sheath. And so each of these, kind of different types of glial cells, particularly the astrocytes and a little bit of the microglia, they're really like kind of the glue that's going to kind of hold things together, right? So that's going to keep kind of that main connection point that we'll see between the different structures within the nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, so again, there are other these non-nervous cells, similar in function a little bit. So we have basically the cell body. So here's the neuron, here's the cell body here, right? And then here's the axon of the peripheral, of that peripheral nervous system cell. And so what we have surrounding the cell body are called satellite cells. These essentially act as the similar to the astrocytes, right? So this is going to regulate any sort of nutrient and waste movement between the neuron and the external environment. So around the cell body, these are actually different cells that are kind of covering or wrapping around that cell body. The other thing to point out are the Schwann cells. So Schwann cells are these flat cells that are going to wrap around the axons in the peripheral nervous system to form the myelin sheath. So you can see in just the figure label, right, satellite cells and Schwann cells surround the neurons in that peripheral nervous system. So it's the Schwann cells that are similar to the oligodendrocytes of the central nervous system. Right, so the satellite cells are like the astrocytes, and the Schwann cells are like the oligodendrocytes. Just one is found in the central nervous system, the other in the peripheral nervous system.